Week 12 is the final week because the instructional phase is complete. Everything required for accurate perception is already online. At this point, adding more insight wouldn't deepen the work. It would dilute it. When a system continues to analyze after clarity is present, analysis becomes avoidance. This week exists to stop that pattern. Up until now, your attention has been trained, not expanded, trained. You learned how emotional response creates meaning, how instinct signals direction before language, and how perception directs structure beneath experience. These capacities were separated so that you could recognize them. They were never meant to remain separate. Their purpose was integration. What ends this week isn't curiosity. What ends is rehearsal. There comes a point where continuing to ask why something is happening becomes a refusal to accept that it already is. That's the point that's been reached. The system now knows enough to move. Further explanation would only create distance between knowing and doing. This week marks the handoff between understanding and responsibility. Responsibility isn't a moral concept here. It's mechanical. It refers to where decisions are allowed to originate. When decisions come from reaction, the system feels busy but powerless. When they come from habit, the system feels consistent but stagnant. When they come from fear, the system feels alert but constrained. None of those states are wrong. They're simply not sustainable once awareness is present. Awareness changes the rules. Once you can see how a decision is forming, you're no longer free to pretend it's forming on its own. You are involved whether you want to be or not. And this is the moment that a lot of people unconsciously retreat. They seek more data, more confirmation, more time. Not because they lack clarity, but because clarity removes plausible deniability. This is where the work becomes uncomfortable in a different way. Earlier discomfort came from confusion, emotional charge, or internal conflict. This discomfort comes from precision, from narrowing of optics, from the realization that fewer explanations remain available. Precision reduces noise, but it also reduces escape routes. This week doesn't soften that moment. It stabilizes you inside it. By now, your internal functions are capable of operating without interference. Instinct no longer needs to shout to be heard. Emotion no longer needs to escalate to register meaning. Perception no longer needs to overanalyze to find a pattern. Voice no longer needs to rush or withhold. These systems can cooperate because awareness is no longer fragmented across them. When this cooperation is in place, something subtle but significant happens. Decisions stop feeling like negotiations. They begin to feel like acknowledgments. Acknowledgement is quieter than motivation. It doesn't hype you up, it doesn't push you forward. It simply recognizes what's already true and removes resistance to acting on it. That's the difference between force and alignment. Force relies on pressure. Alignment relies on congruence. When action aligns with perception, energy stops leaking into internal debate. That's why decisions made from this position feel less dramatic, even when they carry weight. They don't require internal consensus building because consensus already exists. What remains is follow-through. That's where congruence enters the picture differently, not as threat, not as punishment, not as something to manage in advance. Congruence becomes response, information, a signal that tells you how the environment adjusts when you adjust. People who fear congruence often believe that they're afraid of outcomes. More often, they're afraid of being visible as the chooser. Visibility removes the illusion that life is simply happening to them. It reveals participation. This week removes that illusion, not harshly but cleanly. You're not being asked to decide everything at once. You're being asked to notice where decisions are already being made by default, and whether you're willing to take authorship of them. Default choices still shape your life. The only difference is whether you're conscious of them. Small actions matter here more than declarations. A sentence you don't explain, a boundary you don't soften, a decision you don't reopen internally. These moments retrain the system faster than reflection ever could. Because the system learns through evidence. Each time you act without collapsing back into justification, you reinforce the internal hierarchy. Each time you stay present after taking an action, instead of bracing or rehearsing, you build trust. Not confidence, trust. Confidence depends on outcomes. Trust deepens on presence. Presence is the only thing this week is actually training. Presence with choice, with consequence. Presence with uncertainty. Not as practice, but as a posture. By the end of this week, you shouldn't feel finished. You should feel positioned, oriented, less preoccupied with interpretation, less interested in explaining yourself to yourself, more willing to let life respond rather than anticipating every move. That's how you know the transition has occurred. The blueprint doesn't close here because there's nothing left to learn. It closes because learning is no longer the primary function. Living is. You're not stepping into something new. You're staying with what you already know long enough to let it direct you. That's why this is the final week. For most of your life, you probably believed that change came from effort, from learning more, from fixing what was wrong, from waiting until you felt ready enough to move without fear. That belief wasn't foolish, it was functional. It kept you oriented inside uncertainty. But there's a moment where that belief expires, not because it was incorrect, but because it completed its job. At a certain altitude, growth stops being about accumulation and starts being about placement. Nothing new needs to be added. Something needs to be stood inside. What you've been building across this work was not knowledge, it was position. You're not learning how to think better. You're learning where thinking begins. You weren't learning how to feel more. You were learning when feeling informs and when it distorts. You weren't learning how to see the future. You were learning how direction forms before time reveals it. From inside the process, it felt like effort. From above it, it feels like alignment. Here's the part that most people never realize. The moment that clarity arrives, it doesn't ask you to be brave. It asks you to be honest. Honesty is quieter than courage. It doesn't announce itself. It simply removes the lies that you were telling about not knowing. Once those lies fall away, movement is no longer heroic, it's inevitable. This is why the final shift never feels dramatic. Drama belongs to resistance. When resistance ends, what remains feels almost ordinary. Decisions lose their emotional charge. You stop negotiating with yourself. You stop rehearsing conversations that'll never happen. You stop explaining things that are already clear. From the outside, nothing may appear different. From the inside, gravity has changed. You're no longer oriented around what might happen. You're oriented around what is already true. And here's the greatest shift of all. Life doesn't respond to effort, it responds to coherence. When your internal signals stop contradicting each other, the external world adjusts without force. Doors don't always open. Some simply stop needing to be knocked on. This is why the work ends here. Not because you've reached an answer, but because you've reached a vantage point. From this height, the path isn't something you search for. It's something you recognize because you're already standing on it. The self you were trying to become was never ahead of you. It was waiting for you to stop circling. You don't need to leap. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need to feel ready. You only need to stop pretending you don't see what you see. That's the shift. And once it happens, there's no ceremony, there's just movement. Clean, quiet, unargued. This is not the end of a journey. It's the moment you realize you were already where direction originates. And now, you simply stay there.